Hello and welcome to the National Museum of the Pacific Wars webinar series. My name is Jacqueline Mertz and I am the Museum Programs Coordinator here. And we want to thank you for joining us. We have our guest, Dr. Don Carleton, with us, and he will be sharing his book, The Governor and the Colonel, a dual biography of William P. Hobby and Oveta Culp Hobby. And now I am so honored to introduce our presenter, Dr. Don Carleton. He is the Executive Director of the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History and J.R. Parton Chair in the Archives of American History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of 12 books and the executive producer of 2 PBS documentaries. He has been honored with membership in the Texas Institute of Letters, the Austin Headliners Club, and the Philosophical Society of Texas. A native of Dallas, Dr. Carleton earned his doctorate in U.S. history at the University of Houston. Thank you, Dr. Carleton, for coming in today and sharing this story with us.
Well, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Well, thanks to you and your colleagues at the museum for inviting me to do this. And I want to thank all of those folks who have tuned in and give some time in their day to hear something about my book. I'm going to really also, let me mention, I'm going to, after I make my presentation, I'll be answering your questions at the end of this presentation. So my recently published book, The Governor and the Colonel, is a dual biography of William P. Hobby Sr., who is the governor of the title of the governor and the colonel, and Oveta Culp Hobby, who is the colonel, who together were one of the most influential couples in Texas history. And but Oveta herself was one of the most important women in the United States during much of the second half of the 20th century. Now, until now, there has been no comprehensive biography linking and integrating their lives. Will's, and I'll call Governor Hobby Will, if you don't mind. I don't think you'll mind. Will's early success as a politician and newspaper publisher is critical to an understanding of Oveta Culp Hobby's later success on the national stage. They were close partners in all of their business and civic activities. So one did not act without the other, and they were, as I say, they were true partners in every sense of the way. So it's for that reason that I decided to write a dual biography, one that covers more than 100 years of history and is based on research in dozens of archival collections and more than 20 archives and libraries around the country, including 5 presidential libraries. Because I'm giving this presentation for one of the most impressive military museums in the country, I'll focus today on the role Oveta Culp Hobby played in World War II, mainly in the creation and the command of the Women's Army Corps, including her experiences as the first woman in the Army and the difficulties she faced, which there were plenty. I'll also discuss her relationships with some of the most significant figures in the military and in the White House during the war. But first, let me give you some brief background on her husband, Will Hobby, who is an important historical figure in his own right. Please understand that because of the time restraints, I have to leave out most of the story of both Hobbies. After all, the book is about 800 pages in length. Hopefully, my talk will entice you to grab a copy of my book and learn the full history of the Hobbies. A native of East Texas, Will Hobby made a name for himself as a young reporter and editor at the Houston Post in the late 1890s and early 1900s, and then later as an editor and publisher of the Beaumont Enterprise, where he led the effort to make Beaumont a deep water port. He was elected lieutenant governor of Texas in 1914, and when the legislature impeached Governor James Ferguson in 1917, Will became governor, and he served until 1921. During his 4 years as governor, Will oversaw state support of the U.S. military effort in World War I and he was the governor who signed the bill giving Texas women the right to vote. When Will left office, he returned to Houston to become managing editor of the Houston Post. And in 1931, at the age of 53, he married Oveta Culp, a precocious 24-year-old from Killeen. Despite her young age, Oveta, who was the daughter of an attorney and a member of the Texas legislature, I should say her father was a member of the Texas legislature, she had already become well known in state political affairs by the time of her marriage to Will. For example, in 1925, when Oveta was just 20 years old, she was appointed parliamentarian of the Texas House of Representatives before she was old enough even to vote. The hobby team, which is what they were called eventually, of Will and Oveta, quickly forged an intimate personal and professional relationship that led to ownership of the Houston Post and Houston's pioneering KPRC radio station, and later on KPRC television. During the 1930s, Oveta served as an editor of the Houston Post, and she was active in local and regional politics and in women's associations, as well as national organizations like the American Newspaper Publishers Association. So the question is, how did a Houston newspaper editor become the head of the Women's Army Corps, better known as the WACs? Well, in June 1941, this is before the war, when she was attending a newspaper editors conference in Washington, D.C., Oveta was invited to a meeting at the Army's Bureau of Public Relations, which was headquartered in the War Department. She was asked to come there, and with the hope, at least among the Army brass, that she could help solve a major problem for the War Department. That problem was a literal flood of letters from wives, mothers, and girlfriends of draftees, filled with complaints and concerns about the safety and welfare of their loved ones. Oveta suggested the establishment of a special Army office to help handle this public relations issue. It was a suggestion that was immediately accepted by the Army brass and the War Department. And of course, like always, if you're asked to recommend some solution, then frequently you're asked to carry it out yourself. So they accepted her suggestion, and then they asked her to lead it. She agreed to do that, and she was appointed in July 1941. So keep in mind, this is 5 months before Pearl Harbor. She was appointed to be the head of something called and this is new, this was a new thing in the War Department, head of the Women's Interests Section, is what the name they came up with from the bureaucracy. And it was supposed to be, or intended to be, a temporary position. Now, the Army's announcement of Oveta's appointment was widely noted in the press. Stories played up the angle that not only did a woman hold an important administrative job in the Department of War, which was extremely unusual in those days, but she also was working on women's issues in the Army, not previously perceived to be an area of concern to the military, an all-male military, I should quickly add. Her success in this position soon brought her deeply into the battle to create a women's Army Corps. General George C. Marshall, the Army's chief of staff, had advocated for a women's unit as early as the fall of 1939, but his proposal really never made any progress. The expansion of war in Western Europe and in China in 1940 brought new life to the idea. Massachusetts Congresswoman Edith Norse Rogers introduced a bill to establish a women's unit in the Army, but it faced considerable political opposition, especially from the Southern delegation in Congress, which would continue to be a thorn in the side of everyone in favor of women in the Army. However, Pearl Harbor and the reality of full-scale involvement in the war by the United States forced the issue, and the Rogers Bill moved through more quickly through Congress. Now, while the Rogers Bill was still being considered by Congress, General Marshall decided Oveta would be his choice to lead the proposed Women's Corps if it was passed, if the bill was passed, and the Women's Corps would be created. Marshall had worked with Oveta while she was in the Public Relations Bureau, the Women's Interest Unit that we talked about earlier, and he quickly noted her really strong abilities. He asked Oveta to testify to the House Committee on Military Affairs in support of the Rogers Bill. She did an outstanding job at that hearing, and Marshall, who was greatly impressed by her performance, and really Marshall also anticipated the eventual passage of the bill, he asked Oveta to head a task force to plan a women's unit in the Army. Oveta's outstanding work led to Representative Rogers and the Army's personnel section to recommend her to Marshall as the WWII commander, because Women's Army Corps, I'll be probably referring to that from now on as the WWIIs, as the WWII commander in the event that the Women's Corps bill did pass. Accordingly, Marshall persuaded Oveta to take a job that did not yet exist. Secretary of War Stimpson agreed with Marshall's choice, as did President Roosevelt, with strong encouragement from the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who already knew Oveta by this time. The Rogers Bill did indeed pass, and it passed in May of 1942, but its passage was the result of a compromise that made the Women's Corps an auxiliary unit to the Army, not a regular unit. And that meant that the women who joined this organization, which would be called the Women's Auxiliary Corps, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, or the WAAC, like all government things, this is alphabet agencies. And so it's easy to get the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps mixed up with the Women's Army Corps. But the first thing that was created was the Auxiliary Corps, the WAAC. But anyway, women who joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps would not be technically not be in the Army. And therefore, they didn't enjoy Army benefits such as insurance. But they were still subject to military rules and regulations. The day after FDR signed the bill on May the 15th, Secretary Stimpson announced Oveta's appointment as director of the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and she was sworn in with Marshall prominently standing at her side. Oveta had become the commander of an entirely new Army Corps with only one member, herself. Oveta's position was completely new in U.S. military history. There were no precedents for her to follow. And the initial set of regulations, which were makeshift and hastily written while the Rogers Bill had made its way through Congress, had to be completely revised now that the WWIIs were actually a reality. In 1943, largely as a result of Oveta's advocacy and urging, Congress passed a second bill, sponsored again by Congresswoman Rogers, that converted the Women's Auxiliary Corps into a regular part of the Army, finally, and its name was changed simply to the Women's Army Corps, WAC, the WWIIs. On July 1st, 1943, FDR signed the legislation, and Oveta was sworn in on July 5th as a colonel in the regular Army, again with Marshall by her side. Oveta Culp Hobby, Colonel Hobby, had now become a national celebrity, and stories about her path-breaking role, not only as the first woman in the Army, but also as the first woman colonel. And these stories appeared in newspapers throughout the United States. She was also featured on the cover of Time magazine. But despite her newly gained fame, she continually faced a number of difficulties as commander of the WWIIs. Many of her actions and her proposals were strenuously opposed by senior military officers. Most of the Army base commanders where WACs would be assigned made it clear that they had no interest in having WACs assigned to their bases, largely because they didn't understand what jobs the women were capable of performing. Now, I'm fairly confident that most of the audience here will not be surprised in the slightest to know that most of the difficulties Oveta Culp Hobby had to confront were sexist in nature, and that they were directed at her largely by male military officers. When she came into the WACs, there were no other officers but males. Also directed at her by her fellow journalists, as well as male members of Congress. Oveta's struggles with sexist behavior by male Army officers involved nearly every facet of her command. She had battles with the Army in matters both small and large, petty and significant, including, and when you talk about petty, a ludicrous fight about bras, of all things. The Army brass vigorously opposed issuing bras to the WACs. You have to remember that all the enlisted members of the military had their clothing issued to them by the military. So the Army brass vigorously opposed issuing bras to the WACs. And they did that because they decided that bras were a waste of funds and material needed by the military to fight the war. One high-ranking officer weirdly called bras, and when he was complaining about this, he weirdly called bras, quote, surgical contraptions, unquote, that would be made totally unnecessary by rigorous exercise and proper posture by the women. Oveta successfully opposed this ruling, but the bras the Army supplied the women were so badly designed by the Army supply people and fabricated so poorly that most WACs, if not all, wound up spending their personal money to purchase new ones at department stores. Oveta also had to fight the Army's decision not to set up hair salons at WAC bases where they were stationed. She won that argument as well by pointing out to the command that every Army base had a barber shop for the men. Never occurred to the brass that that was unfair. She won that argument. When the Army sent African-American male soldiers to England, British authorities complained to the US government that the soldiers were dating white English women. To solve the problem, General Eisenhower in London, who was in command in London, made a request, an official request for African-American WACs to be sent to England to provide, quote, unquote, female companionship, unquote, for African-American male soldiers stationed there. Oveta angrily protested this request to General Marshall, arguing that neither Black or white WACs had been enlisted for the purpose of providing companionship to male soldiers of any race. Marshall quickly agreed with this, and Eisenhower found himself in a hard spot. He eventually apologized to Oveta when they became friends later. Another serious problem arose when the Army decided to grant honorable discharges to married WACs if they became pregnant while in the Corps. They decided, however, that unmarried WACs who became pregnant would be dishonorably discharged for the previously unknown offense of pregnancy without permission. Oveta hit the roof in anger. In a contentious meeting with Army brass, she argued the regulation not only was unfair, it also was legally untenable. I should point out here that Oveta did not graduate from law school, but she did come close to it. She left to go to the Houston Post, but she did know the law. And she argued that that whole thing was legally untenable. I should also emphasize that a dishonorable, as many of you know, if not all of you, a dishonorable discharge is carried with a person their whole life, and it does have negative ramifications. So anyway, obviously, she argued that it was legally untenable, and she said there was no such thing as an illegal pregnancy, either in military or civilian law. She asked if male soldiers who fathered children with women who weren't their wives would also be subject to the regulation. The Army made a hasty retreat at that point. This rampant sexism began to hurt Oveta's recruiting efforts, actually. In response, she submitted a detailed report to General Marshall that about the hostile attitudes and actions of Army leadership towards women in the military. On the basis of Oveta's report, General Marshall issued a letter to all of his commanding officers calling for all members of the Army to recognize the dignity and importance of the work of women in the war effort. That's a quote from his letter. Marshall's letter was perceived by base commanders as an order from the chief of staff, and it had a very positive effect on behavior, at least among the officer class. Oveta also faced sexist behavior in her dealings with many male members of Congress. I know this will be a shock and a stunning shock to the audience, but nonetheless, it did happen. For example, when she testified to Congress in support of creating the WWII, Oveta had to put up with people like South Carolina Senator Cotton Ed Smith, who complained that the creation of the WWII would literally lead to the downfall of the country. He charged that it would result in utter disrespect for womanhood because of all of this, and I'll quote Cotton Ed, all of this nonsense about how many girdles and brassieres and things that women are going to wear will cause us to lose our modesty as a nation and surely lead us to fail. Another congressman asked Oveta at one of the hearings, who would remain at home to cook dinner and wash clothes and clean the house? Even Oveta's Army rank was the result of sexism. Although the size of her command more than qualified her to be a general officer, the Southern delegation in Congress rigidly refused to allow her a higher rank than colonel, strictly on the grounds she was a woman, a reason they openly admitted. Perhaps most disappointing to Oveta was the sexism she faced from her fellow journalists. At her first press conference as the WWII commander, she was beset by questions that would never be asked of a man. She was asked what color of panties the WWII would be issued. Would the women be wearing girdles? And would they be allowed to put on makeup? How about nail polish? What was she, by the way, what was she carrying in her purse? In news stories about the Women's Corps, journalists often referred to the WWII as I should say the actual Corps itself, as the petticoat army. Individual WWIIs themselves were referred to as wackies, Amazons, and lesbos. The WWII training camp at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, was called Fort Lipstick. When Oveta complained, reporters simply told her to get a sense of humor. The news media often stressed Oveta's physical appearance. She was quite a lovely woman, but sometimes to an absurd extent. At one point, the Associated Press photographers asked if they could take a picture of Colonel Hobby in a swimsuit standing on the diving board of the swimming pool at the WWII officer training camp in Iowa. An Army press officer quickly vetoed that idea with the explanation that there would be no, quote, cheesecake of the boss, unquote. Columnists, newspaper columnists writing in the sensational tabloid press spread rumors that many WACs were prostitutes and or lesbians. One gossip columnist claimed that Oveta arranged for the Army to issue condoms to all of her WACs. The columnist later admitted, after causing a great deal of trouble, that his claim was totally false. Oveta moved, which was true, it was false. Oveta moved through these challenges using her considerable diplomatic and leadership skills. Notably, her ability to cultivate relationships with key figures that could advance the cause of women in military service. Her connection to General George Marshall, which we've mentioned earlier, was key to Oveta's ability to maneuver, or at times outmaneuver, the military bureaucracy. Marshall remained Oveta's most steadfast and loyal supporter throughout her tenure as commander of the WACs. For example, after the US invasion of North Africa in November 1942, Eisenhower asked for 5 WAC officers who were fluent in French to be stationed in Algiers to assist his headquarters with badly needed translation and clerical support. Oveta selected 5 volunteers for the assignment. To her dismay, she learned a few days after Thanksgiving that a German U-boat torpedoed and sank the ship carrying her WAC officers. Thankfully, the women survived, but the incident highlighted the WAC's lack of protection. As at that time, this was before, this was when they were still the WWII, when they were still auxiliary members of the Army. But they highlighted the fact that they lacked protection as not full members of the Army. They were not given the extra war zone pay that other soldiers were given or other members of the military. They weren't given medical benefits, or they didn't have the same legal rights as military prisoners of war should they be captured. Soon after this incident in North Africa, when Eisenhower placed another request for WAC support in that area, Oveta raised her objections to General Marshall. He nonetheless directed her to ask for volunteers from the Corps who would agree to be sent into quote unquote hazardous conditions. Oveta, disgruntled but following orders, assembled 300 WACs at a count and asked for volunteers. All but 2 of the WACs stepped forward to volunteer. The 2 who did not step forward had disabled parents who needed their care. At this show of bravery, Oveta, on the verge of tears, had to stop her speech, and she hastily sought privacy in a bedroom closet where she cried. 200 of the volunteers were eventually sent to North Africa. While Marshall overruled Oveta's request, Marshall was very sympathetic to her concerns about, and this was a period, again, let me remind you, when the women were not really in the Army, they were auxiliaries. Marshall even paid out of his own pocket for replacement clothes for the 5 WAC officers who had been fished out of the Mediterranean because they weren't eligible for reimbursement due to their lack of status as members of the Army. He also arranged for the women to be guests at a dinner hosted by FDR and Winston Churchill at the Casablanca conference. And while they were there, they were called up to meet FDR and Churchill, and they were recognized for their bravery. And from that point forward, Marshall provided public support to the effort to make the women of the Corps part of the regular Army. Another one of Oveta's key relationships was Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady and Oveta first met in Texas in 1936 when the Roosevelts were in Houston, and they developed a warm association. The First Lady helped Oveta from the beginning of her military service when she led the women's interest section in the PR Bureau. She also worked hard and supported the first Rogers Bill that established the Women's Auxiliary. In 1942, Oveta joined Eleanor Roosevelt for an important 3-week trip to the United Kingdom to boost U.S. relations with the British. I should point out here that they flew secretly, in great secrecy, and a Pan Am, what do you call them, seaplane, flew from New York first to Ireland and then into England. And it was a rather hazardous trip, actually. Top secret. Of course, it was not publicized, but it was still some danger. Oveta was invited to join Roosevelt on this trip and for the reason of evaluating the Women's Service Organization, which was Britain's version of the WACS. When they arrived in London, they were greeted by King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. And Oveta when she was in London, or in England, I should say, or the UK is an even more correct way, Oveta made multiple tours of women's army operations in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. She also witnessed firsthand how badly the US Army operations in England needed WAC support. Also, Oveta also worked with Eleanor Roosevelt on racial matters. She worked with Eleanor Roosevelt and Black civil rights leader Mary McLeod Bethune to include Black women in the WACs, although unhappily in racially segregated units, and also to allow them to serve in Europe. There was much opposition from the Southern delegation on even allowing Black women in the WACs or even sending them to Europe. The First Lady was a dependable source of support when Oveta had issues with the press and Congress. She also helped provide a major PR boost in April 1943 when she encouraged her husband, President Roosevelt, to make a visit to Fort Oglethorpe, the third training camp for the WACs there in Georgia. It was during her UK trip with Eleanor Roosevelt that Oveta first met General Dwight Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower's unassuming style and humor soon really endeared him to Oveta. At their first luncheon after Oveta arrived in London in 1942, she accepted Ike's invitation. What we'll call it, as you know, the nickname of Dwight Eisenhower was Ike. She accepted Ike's invitation to join him for lunch at the Dorchester Hotel. As they entered the restaurant, Oveta surprised Ike by stepping aside and letting him go in first because he outranked her. Unaccustomed to entering a room ahead of his female guests, Ike howled with laughter and declared, quote, that where he came from, a lady was a lady, unquote, and not a member of the military, where rank overruled really traditional rules of etiquette in male-female relations. For example, another example of the Eisenhower and Oveta getting to know each other in London in that trip, during a formal dinner hosted by the U.S. ambassador to the UK, John Winnett, Oveta was badly in need of a cigarette. She was a chain smoker. But etiquette, English etiquette, dictated that no one could smoke until the host had made a toast to the king. Himself a fellow smoker, Eisenhower he could tell that Oveta was in some distress and really needed a cigarette. And so he called out, "Mr. Ambassador, are we going to toast the king or not?" He then, Eisenhower, reached into his pocket and tossed a pack of cigarettes into Oveta's lap. During the long flight over to the UK, the flight crew also initiated Oveta into something called the Short Snorter Club. Now, this was an initiation. It was a ritual in which flight crews and their passengers, while in the air above the Atlantic Ocean, signed dollar bills called short snorters, just a regular, U.S. dollar bill, which conveyed good luck to the soldiers crossing the Atlantic in convoys beneath them, I should say, which they could see, by the way. They could see convoys from their airplane as they were flying over the Atlantic during daylight. Signing these dollar bills initiated the passengers into something called the Short Snorters Club, which then required them to carry the signed dollar bill with them at all times. Now, when they ran into another member of the club and were asked if they were a member of the club, they were then required, according to the rules of this sort of fun club, either to produce their signed dollar bill that they had signed over the Atlantic as proof of their membership, or they had to buy every short snorter present a drink or pay them $1. So during a dinner at Oveta's hotel, Eisenhower looked at Oveta and boomed out loudly, "Are you a short snorter?" Oveta answered that she was, before realizing that she had left her signed dollar bill in the hotel room upstairs. Ike, who guessed that she didn't have the short snorter with her, gleefully told her it was going to cost her several dollars if she didn't quickly produce the signed dollar bill. Oveta immediately jumped up from her chair, raced out of the dining room to the elevator and up to her room, got the bill, and was back in the dining room just before her time limit expired, much to Eisenhower's delight and much laughter. Well, from this point on, Eisenhower and Oveta maintained a deep and respectful friendship that would ultimately have a significant bearing on Eisenhower's nomination for the presidency in 1952, and it would last until Eisenhower's death in 1969. Several years after the war had ended, Ike told Oveta in a letter, he said, "You were the first one that sold the wax to me. I must say, the wax proved themselves under your leadership to be one of the finest organizations that the Army has ever had." In 1953, 8 years after the war, Eisenhower would appoint Oveta as a secretary of the newly established Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, then known as HEW, thus becoming only the second woman in U.S. history to serve on a presidential cabinet. Now, due to health issues caused in no small part by her overwhelming workload, Oveta resigned her position in June 1945. When she left the Army, the WACs were a fully functional and vital unit that the Army realized it could not do without. The WACs would continue until the Army integrated women into its regular units and disbanded the Corps completely. After the war, Oveta reassumed her position as publisher of the Houston Post. Will died in 1964. The city of Houston named its municipal airport in Will Hobby's honor. So that you pass through that airport and you're wondering who Hobby was, or if you're wondering, well, like a lot of people, which Hobby is this named for? It is named for William P. Hobby. So Oveta, after her husband's death, continued as the head of the Houston Post and the Hobby family's media holdings, including KPRC radio and TV. She also continued her involvement in public service. For example, during LBJ's presidency, Oveta accepted appointments for service on several important task forces, including one that centered on Vietnam during the war, and another that led to the creation of PBS and NPR. Will and Oveta's son, William P. Hobby Jr., better known as Bill Hobby, was elected lieutenant governor of Texas in 1972. He held that office until 1991 and was the longest serving lieutenant governor in Texas history. Oveta told the Houston Post, she sold the Houston Post in 1983 and KPRC TV in 1994. She died at the age of 90 in 1995. For all that Oveta accomplished throughout her life, she will likely be best remembered for her service during World War II. She organized every aspect of the Corps from scratch, and in the face of all opposition, eventually enlisting more than 150,000 women who served in all theaters of the war. When Oveta resigned, Eleanor Roosevelt stated, quote, "How well she handled the job may be attested by the fact that we now have women in every branch of our military services in uniform, receiving the same pay and rating as the men, performing almost every type of duty except combat. A great deal of the credit goes to Oveta Culp Hobby," unquote. In recognition of her outstanding performance as a WWII commander, the Army awarded her the Distinguished Service Medal, the first woman so honored. In 2011, the Postal Service issued a stamp in Oveta Culp Hobby's honor. The portrait of Oveta on the stamp depicts her in her WWII uniform. Her contributions to the war effort were so significant that she's the only woman who is quoted on the World War II memorial on the National Mall in Washington. Her quote joined those only of FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, MacArthur, and of course, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Her quote is, and if you go there, "Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it." I want to thank you. And before I take questions, I want to show you just a few photographs from my book, if we have time here. This, of course, is the cover of the book. This is a picture of the very young. This is right after she was appointed, actually. She was 20 years old, with the Speaker of the House, the young parliamentarian of the Texas House of Representatives, okay? This is a photograph, a portrait of Oveta when she was an editor at the Houston Post in the 1930s. This is a photograph of her taken by a photojournalist and it was published in newspapers all around the country when she first took the job at the War Department in the Women's Interest Bureau, okay? This is a photograph. She organized a meeting of the leaders of women's organizations in the United States. That's her back in the back, dressed in the dark clothing. And that's General Marshall that she had come and address the women, okay? This is at her signing when she was sworn in as the head of the WAAC, the Auxiliary Corps. That's Will Hobby next to her, obviously, and that is Congresswoman Rogers, okay? This is Oveta with her sort of second in command, Betty Bandel, at the training headquarters in Iowa. And this is Oveta with Eleanor Roosevelt and representatives of the Women's Corps there in Great Britain during their tour in the fall of 1942. General Marshall loaned, of course, Oveta, but also Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, his personal Army plane to fly to various camps that the WWIIs were running. And this is a photograph. On the right, of course, is Oveta. The man in the middle, whose name is I don't know, was Marshall's one of Marshall's personal pilots, and of course, that's the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, next to him. All right. This is a photograph of Oveta with Franklin Roosevelt, of course, and this is during the tour of Fort Oglethorpe. All right. This is Oveta being sworn in as a colonel the first woman in the Army, and that's General Marshall with her as always, standing in the middle. All right. This is Oveta went on a tour of WWII bases and posts in North Africa, and this is when she was in Egypt and took a tour of the pyramids. This is her cover on Time magazine. All right. This is Secretary of War Henry Stimpson awarding her the Distinguished Service Award. And the gentleman, just to Stimpson's right is Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, and Marshall is obscured behind Stimpson. All right. This is on the 3rd anniversary. This is in Times Square in New York City, and it is the parade of wax that paraded before Oveta, right before she resigned for health reasons as commander of the WWII. The woman you see in the middle who is facing the statue there is actually announcing that particular troop to Oveta, who's obscured by the statue. Okay. And this is a photograph of Eisenhower, President Eisenhower by this time, with Oveta, who's on his cabinet. And I like that photograph a lot because it really conveys the warm relationship that those two had for each other. I don't know if I've eaten up all of my time. Looks like we have 10 minutes or so.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Carleton, for that great story about Oveta. I've done my own research on the wax myself, and this gives me more incentive to even spend more time learning her story.
Great.
So we do have a couple questions. So our first one is from Kinsey. She asks, how much time of Oveta's service during the war was spent abroad?
Oh, very little. She spent 3 weeks in the United Kingdom. She spent, this hardly counts, but she spent a week in Canada. And then she went back, I believe it was in 44. And she spent some time again in the United Kingdom. And then she went down. By this time, we had wax all over the UK working. And we also had wax all over North Africa. And also, by this time, the war had gone on into Sicily and Italy. The Italian campaign was underway. And she actually went to the front in Italy and met with General Clark, the commander of our forces in Italy. So, and then she made this little side trip to Egypt that you saw where she was riding a camel. So, total maybe 5 weeks or 6 weeks, something like that. But her job was in Washington. Now, she traveled all over the United States because there were WWII, posts all over the United States that she inspected, and they also had training camps. And then she also did a lot of, one of her jobs was to publicize the WWII and to recruit new members.
Next one is from Gregory. He said that he was delighted to pass Oveta's burial place in Houston Glenwood Cemetery while on a walking tour. And he he figured out that Will was buried there, but he didn't see any gravestone. Are they together?
Yeah, well, yes, actually, we didn't have time for this. There's so much more of this story than we've got time for. But Will Hobby was actually married before he married Oveta. His first wife died. She had a cerebral hemorrhage and died in her sleep unexpectedly. And she's also buried there. All three of them are buried there in that cemetery.
This is from Stephen. Were the nurses that treated soldiers in the war also in the wax?
No, they were not. Interestingly enough, the military had used nurses in World War I and previous wars, actually, but they were not part of the military.
Okay, question from James. What was the relationship between the WWII commander and the WASP commander?
Oh, well, they had a council. There was a commander of the Women Marines. There was a commander of the Waves, WAVES, which were, of course, the women in the Navy. And they met, they had lunch every couple of weeks, and they, commiserated. They all had problems with being women and enterprise where men were not particularly happy to see them there. So they had lots to talk about.
Do we have any other questions from our audience? We're still looking for any more. I guess I can ask one of mine. Dr. Carleton, what was your favorite part of Oveta's life that you enjoyed reading about or learning about?
Clearly, her experiences in World War II. Mm-hmm. It's an area, World War II is one of my interests anyway, as a historian. So naturally, I had an interest in that. But I was also interested in the role that she played. I wrote a book called Red Scare, which was about McCarthyism in Texas, and she played a role as the publisher of the Houston Post, and really attacking some of the witch hunts that were going on. So I found that very interesting because she took a lot of risks doing that. And also she, as the secretary of HEW, another very interesting part, because of the connection with us today, is that she oversaw the development of the Salk vaccine for polio. And it was under her that a program had to be put together to distribute the vaccine. And they had as many problems, not quite as bad as we have today, but they had a lot of the similar problems with distributing the Salk vaccine that we've had with this current vaccine. Although there weren't there were hardly any anti-vaxxers, but there was a big dispute. There was a very strong fear about socialized medicine, and so she, did everything she could to keep the distribution of the vaccine out of the federal hands and leaving it to the states and private enterprise. Wow.
What a life that she has led. And so I think we don't have any other questions. Nothing has come in. So we're going to end a little bit early today. So thank you again, Dr. Carleton, for sharing the story behind the hobbies. And if you're interested, we are selling our book online. Go ahead and pick one up if you haven't already. I'm really looking forward to reading it.
Can I say something here?
Of course.
Yes. If you buy the book, I want everyone to know I get no royalties from the book. The royalties from the book go to support our efforts to preserve history at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History. So not only, hopefully, hope you think this, where you'll be getting some interesting information, but you'll also be contributing to a good cause in the preservation of our history.
That's awesome. So keep that in mind if you're interested in purchasing one. And we want to thank you, everyone, for your ongoing support of the museum and our programs. Thank you again, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.